As usual, we took the same road that night for our camping trip. Weekends for us were always an opportunity to escape from work, leave the city behind, and lose ourselves in nature. This trip, however, would not be like the usual ones. This night would be anything but ordinary. By the time the sun's last rays vanished, the shadows of the trees grew long as we stepped into the night. We had been here countless times before, so setting up our tents and lighting the campfire felt almost routine. We settled around the fire, and soon conversations, songs, and laughter filled the air. Everything seemed perfectly normal, but there was something different. I could feel it, though I couldn't quite understand what it was. It was around midnight when we began telling each other scary stories, as we often did during camping trips. The tales grew increasingly eerie as the night went on. One of our friends, as usual, decided to spook us all even more, saying, "This area is infamous for strange occurrences. People say tents disappear here, and some mornings, campers wake up to find their tents gone." At that moment, an unsettling chill settled over the group. We were camping very close to the area where such tales were rumored to have taken place. Many years ago, a group of campers had allegedly experienced a bizarre event, waking up to find their tents missing, only for them to reappear at dawn, empty of all their contents. Some swore the tents disappeared without a trace, as if they had never existed. Like all rumors, though, these stories seemed exaggerated. Still, the tension in the air was palpable. In spite of our rational minds, we couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something was just not right. As the evening wore on, one of our friends suddenly got up and decided to step out of the tent. We didn't think much of it at first, but soon after, one of the tents was missing. A silence fell over us. We exchanged uneasy glances. No one truly believed that the tent had been taken to another dimension, but something had definitely happened. The tent's location was nowhere to be found. It wasn't just a random disappearance. This wasn't some fleeting moment of confusion. It felt as though the tent had disappeared without leaving a single trace. It wasn't a normal vanishing act. This felt deliberate. As the hours passed, I began to suspect there was more to this than just an unusual occurrence. A friend of ours, trying to mask their fear, muttered, "Maybe the wind blew it away." But none of us bought it. I was the first to notice the absence of the tent. As the night grew longer, the eerie events began to align with the story we had just heard. There was something wrong, something unsettling about the whole situation. Hours passed, and our friend, the one whose tent had vanished, returned from the woods walking slowly with an empty look in their eyes. They had returned without a trace of any sign that they had been lost. There had been no sound, no disturbance, just an overwhelming feeling of loneliness. By the time we made it through the night, something had changed in all of us. That vanishing tent, it was connected to something beyond our understanding. The next morning, the tent reappeared, but there was something strange about it. No one had seen anyone near it, and the person who had gone missing was nowhere to be found. We searched, we called out, but there was no trace of them. The tent and the missing person were like two opposite forces, connected, yet completely distant from one another. The mystery surrounding that vanishing tent and the loss of a camper would remain forever unanswered. As fear crept in, something seemed to be approaching us from the shadows of the forest, but no one had the courage to speak about what happened. As we left the forest, we saw one last fleeting figure. The camper who had vanished was no longer there. The secret of that missing tent had turned into a void that could never be filled. It was meant to be a peaceful weekend, just like all the others. We had set out on our regular camping trips to escape the chaos of daily life. A small group of close friends, our gear, and a deep love for nature were all we needed for a perfect weekend. But this weekend would end up being different, darker. We arrived at the campsite as the last light of the day slipped behind the horizon, and the quiet of the forest greeted us. The air was thick with the smell of pine, and the wind whispered through the trees. There was something about the way the wind moved, as though it was alive. We set up our tents, built a campfire, and settled in for the evening. As the fire crackled, we began our usual round of stories. We always tried to outdo one another with tales of adventure, but tonight there was a certain tension in the air. The forest felt different, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. It was when one of our friends, Mark, began speaking in a low voice that the atmosphere shifted completely. "I've heard stories about these woods," Mark said, his eyes glinting with mischief. "Some say the forest isn't as peaceful as it seems. There's a legend about a camper who disappeared here a few years ago, right in the middle of the night. No one ever found out what happened to him. His friends searched for days, but all they found was his abandoned tent and his backpack. And the strangest thing? The trees around that area are said to whisper to those who listen closely." We all laughed, brushing off the tension with humor. But the wind shifted again, a sudden gust carrying a strange, whispering sound that we couldn't explain. We stared at each other uneasily, but nobody dared to say anything. Mark's story had caught our attention, even if we were reluctant to admit it. As the night wore on, the fire grew low and the forest fell silent. The wind had stopped completely. It was then that we noticed something odd. One of the tents had been disturbed. It wasn't much, just a slight movement, as if someone had brushed past it. We all stood up, looking toward the tent. Mark, the one who had told the story, laughed nervously and said, "Probably just the wind." But as we looked closer, we saw something more disturbing. The tent flap was slightly open, and there was a faint, unnatural glow coming from within. It was as if someone had lit a lantern inside, but none of us had seen anyone enter. Cautiously, we approached the tent, but as we got closer, the glow vanished. The tent was completely dark, and there was no sign of anyone inside. Our hearts began to race. Something wasn't right. We quickly checked all the tents, but one of us was missing. Sarah, the quietest of the group, was nowhere to be found. Her belongings were still inside the tent, but she had vanished. Panic set in. We shouted her name, but there was no answer. The whispers in the trees seemed louder now, as if the forest itself was mocking our fear. The search began. We spread out through the dark woods, calling out for Sarah, but it was like she had disappeared into thin air. No footprints, no sounds, just the eerie whispering of the trees. The silence felt suffocating, and the deeper we ventured, the more we felt as if something unseen was watching us. Hours passed, and we had no luck finding her. We were on the brink of exhaustion, our nerves shot, when suddenly the whispering stopped. The forest was dead quiet, as though it had decided to withhold its secrets from us. We made our way back to the camp, desperate for some kind of explanation. At the campsite, we found something that sent chills down our spines. Sarah's tent, the one we had checked earlier, was no longer empty. She was lying inside, but she wasn't asleep. Her eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling of the tent, unblinking. She didn't respond to us, didn't move, didn't even seem to notice our presence. It was as if she was frozen in time. We rushed to her side, trying to wake her, but she didn't speak a word. It was like the life had been drained from